All right, the next thing that we are going to discuss is parenting and parenting styles. Now, for younger generations, and most of my students are of a younger generation that I am, younger generations often kind of take it for granted that there is a verb, parenting. Parenting is something you can do. This is actually a fairly new concept. Around the 1970s, this was a new emerging idea that we could talk about, we could describe, we could study the behaviors that parents engaged in and to learn about, their influence on child development, for example. So this idea of parenting as a verb, it's fairly new. It's something that was new when I was born. And just to give you very brief little history here, if you think about it, in the for the longest time, the job of parents was to keep their children alive, and it was a struggle. Before we had advances in modern medicine, advances in sanitation and hygiene, there were lots of things that made life very dangerous for people. So parents' jobs were like, hey, we got to keep our children alive. We got to help them survive. It wasn't until we started to have these advances that children started to survive on a large scale that we're like, oh, well, we don't just help our children survive. We can do other things, like we could help our children thrive, perhaps, rather than just survive. All right, so we know parents have to provide certain things. You have to provide things like food, shelter, school, medical care. If you don't do those things, you would be accused of neglect, an actual I don't know if you can hear the police siren out there. All right. Like criminal neglect you could be accused of neglect. You can get in trouble with the law if you don't provide those basics. All right. So parenting, it really doesn't involve those basics. The assumption is you're going to do those basics. All right. What do you do beyond the basics? What do you do beyond providing food and shelter? That's the minimum. That's what you're supposed to do. You got to do that. All right, so the first researcher to look at the first researcher to really, something's going on out there. The first researcher to do really influential work on parenting was Diana Baumrind in the 70s. And Baumrind proposed 3 parenting styles. If you've been paying attention to previous videos, you might anticipate we started with 3 and then we added a 4th one. Also, for the temperament video, I'm realizing I don't think I mentioned the 4th temperament that we added later. I'm going to have to do a little separate video and add it on there. All right, so with our parenting styles, we have authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and then later we added in uninvolved. Let's talk about those first 3 that were identified. All right, so we've got authoritarian. Now, authoritarian, it's got the word authority in it. When you think of authority, you probably think of structures and rules. Yes, the authoritarian parenting style does involve rigid rules and structure. When Baumrind came up with these categories, they were based on the presence or absence of demandingness and responsiveness. So demandingness is like, do you have rules? Do you have structure? Do you have expectations for your child? Responsiveness, do you respond to the child's needs? Are you trying to help the child? Are you communicating with your child? All right, so authoritarian parenting is really high in demandingness. All right, so these parents have high expectations for their children. They are punitive. They punish when the child steps out of line or doesn't meet their expectations. They are also low in responsiveness. So low in things like communication. They're not going to explain the rules to the child. They're not going to explain the reasons for punishment. They're just going to do it. They are not going to do things like nurture and encourage their child. They're just going to expect them to live up to those expectations. So it's kind of like, well, why do I have to do this? Don't talk back to me. And the reason why is because I'm in charge. I'm the authority. You have to listen. I am in charge here. That is sort of your very basic description of the authoritarian parenting style. With authoritarian, I always think, it's got those 2 R's in it. At some point, I used a textbook that said you can think of those 2 R's as standing for rigid ruler. So rigid as meaning unbending, not flexible. And ruler, like I rule you. I am the ruler. I am the king. I am the dictator. That sort of thing. And so with the authoritarian, think high structure, high demandingness, very punitive. All right. What about the other parenting style that starts with authority? Authoritative parenting. Okay, well, and it is unfortunate that it's named in such a way that students always mix these two up. That's why I like to recommend that they think of rigid ruler for authoritarian. For authoritative, it's got a bunch of T's in it. Think of two of those T's as standing for tender, teacher. All right, tender, because they're high in responsiveness. They are high in communication and nurturing and encouragement of the child. They are also high in demandingness. That's why they have authority in their name. So these parents, they have rules. They have structure. But the rules and the structure are explained. They talk to their children. They explain what's expected of them. They explain the reasons for the things that they do. They set things up so children can talk to them. They can question the rules from time to time. Now, the parent is still an authority figure, so they don't just let the child do whatever they want. But if the child questions something, they will explain, no, this is exactly why you have that rule. And they're flexible with the rules. If a child suggests something like, hey, you say my bedtime is 9. Can I stay up until 9:30? They're willing to say, okay, why? Why do you think you need to stay up till 9:30? Or why do you think you can handle staying up to 9:30 and still wake up for school the next day? They will listen. You know, they may not agree with the child, but they will listen if they want to bring up some alternative ideas. All right. So authoritative parenting. It's the hardest because it's high in both things. It's high in demandingness and responsiveness. It takes the most work. All right. But so they're very nurturing. They're warm and loving and encouraging, but they also have structure. They also have rules. Now, what about permissive, sometimes called indulgent parenting? Well, this one is low in demandingness, but high in responsiveness. So these folks, they are warm and loving and affectionate and nurturing, and they talk to their kids, they communicate with their kids, but they don't have rules and structure. They don't impose rules and structure. You know, if the child is like, hey, when are we having dinner? They're like, well, whenever you're hungry. When do I have to go to bed? When you're ready. It's, you know, they don't impose those rules, those structure. You know, the child's like, hey, am I supposed to get good grades? And they're like, oh, if you want to, you know, if the child does get good grades in school, they're gonna be like, oh, yay, good work. They'll encourage them, but they are not going to, you know, they're not going to demand that the child gets good grades, for example. Now, the fourth parenting style that was added later is one that doesn't have demandingness or responsiveness. So this is called the uninvolved parenting style, sometimes called the neglectful parenting style, but the tricky issue with that is there's a legal term, neglect. And remember, we're not talking about people, these are people who wouldn't be guilty of neglect. They do the minimum. They do the minimum to keep their child alive, but they don't do anything extra. They don't impose rules. They don't provide encouragement and support. They're not having conversations. They're the ones who are like, where's your child right now? I don't know. You know, well, what did you do today as a parent? Well, I made sure my child had food, made sure that my child was dressed, you know, to go to school. That's it. That's all I need to do. I met their basic needs. So the uninvolved parent, they don't do anything beyond meeting the basic needs. All right. So these parenting styles are linked with later behavior in longitudinal studies. I talk much more detail when I teach developmental psychology classes, but to give you the short version, generally you see better outcomes with the authoritative parenting style. Those children are more independent, more generous as they grow older. They have more success in school, social skills. There's just a lot of things that are higher in folks who have been exposed to an authoritative parenting style. Now, that being said, we don't want to shame parents who fall short of having an authoritative parenting style, because remember, it's the hardest. We do know that in times of stress, that Authoritarian and permissive can be more likely in times of stress. It's like you choose, okay, I can't do demandingness and responsiveness. I'm going to do one. I'm going to focus on just one. That's one way that you could think of it. So I often, I like to advise students, don't take this as an excuse to like judge parents for parenting wrong. There's enough of that in the world. All right, just be aware that a parent should try to be as authoritative as possible because there's evidence for it, probably being the more beneficial parenting style.